Hi, I'm Will.
And I'm Luke.
And this is Will and Luke Discuss,
a vodcast
and podcast
where we discuss content related to psychology,
personal growth,
self-development,
and well-being. This episode, we're discussing
Chatter by Ethan Kross. Format of today is that Will has read this book, Chatter by Ethan Kross. I have not. And I'm going to ask Will about it. Hopefully share any insights I have on whatever the subject matter is. And I hope we both come out learning a bit more than we have right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Sounds good.
So sounds good. So this book, Chatter, The Voice in Our Head and How to Harness It. So Ethan Kross, he is a psychologist and leading expert in the controlling of the conscious mind. And he works at Emotional and Self-Control Lab. And this book and his expertise falls into the area of cognitive psychology.
Nice one. So what is chatter? What does he mean by chatter?
So I think when he's talking about chatter, I think he's referring more to the negative side of having an inner voice. So he does make quite a clear delineation between there being an inner voice that can be encouraging, that kind of helps keep our mind updated and tracks how we're going along and can be quite encouraging. But then chatter is when it falls into more ruminations, worry, anxiety, kind of that spiraling off thinking that can kind of expand and take over our whole mental energy due to its negative nature. Yeah.
So we've got our own speaking to ourselves in our mind, and then that can be kind of helpful or unhelpful. And when it goes down the line of being unhelpful, that's what he means by chatter, like the unhelpful talk in our head.
Yeah. And I think he refers to it particularly because there's a whole heap of, negative side effects. And he does start off saying, why we talk to ourselves is one of the first chapters. And then he gets into the how talking to ourselves backfires. And when he's talking about the more negative effects, that's what he's referring to as chatter.
Yeah. And did you get the impression it was just about inner chat? Or because when for example, you mentioned ruminating, sometimes I'll think like in images, cinematically, I might be rehashing a situation that happened, and I won't necessarily be narrating it, but I'll be sort of viewing it. Or if I'm like mentally rehearsing something in the future, I'll be like picturing it happening. Do you think that comes into this, or is it just about how we speak to ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's not so much around, not entirely around there being this kind of voice in the back of your head or sort of having a running commentary specifically. It can kind of fall into, like images or any kind of negative pattern of thinking that kind of distracts you and takes up mental energy. So it says things around, compulsive rehashing of events, right? Things like that can be sabotaging. I suppose that would come in a variety of forms, and how we respond to that varies as well.
Yeah. So he sort of chatters a nice way of honing in on it, but it might not necessarily be literally talk, but often it is like the way we talk to ourselves in our minds.
Yeah, I think it's his way of framing it. Yeah. So
you said he first talks about why we have this inner monologue. Maybe we could start by some of his ideas about why we have it.
Yeah, I thought this was actually really, really interesting. So I do love the way the book kind of flows and goes through all these different ideas. But what he says, the reasons we talk to ourselves. So he's saying that we have this inner monologue that we can reflect forwards in time, so we can think about what could happen in the future, obviously, and then we can reflect back on things that have happened. And it's really common for us as humans to be able to mentally time travel kind of back and forth, and that can have a healthy nature to it in regards of things like learning from mistakes or processing regrets, things like that, or making plans for the future. But what he's saying is our inner voice evaluates our progress towards goals. So he says we analyze our identities through internal verbal streams. We write and rewrite the story of our lives to stay coherent. So he's saying that these voices are constantly kind of evaluating whether we're moving towards our desired outcomes or moving away from them. And that's where kind of more positive inner talk would be things like, you're moving towards your goals, and all the kind of the positive affirmations that come with that, like, oh, well done, positive mental images and like good feelings associated with that. But then the negative side of it is like, you idiot, you're not moving towards where you need to go, you're not good enough. Kind of at its worst, sort of being like quite critical of your progress and why things aren't going the way you want them to go. And I think I really like the bit around, kind of we analyze our identities through these internal verbal streams, and and we do it as a way of sort of balancing the temperature, and the ideal temperature is where like our inner talk and who we are and our identities are coherent. We have a coherent sense of self, and we're constantly kind of like trying to manage that balance
like
by
homeostatic
like more or less. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a few things there. Well, I'll jump into what just popped into my head, because you said, there's like a positive way of like encouragement or feeling good when our like what actually happens aligns with our plans and goals and sense of identity. And then we can be self-critical perhaps when it doesn't. But then there are also times where things don't go to plan, and we are technically critical, or at least evaluative. So I'm thinking like, I go for a forehand tennis shot and I just whip it down into the net, and I'm a bit annoyed, but like in my head I almost instantly picture the action I just did and how it ought to be, how I need to self-correct. And generally, even if I'm a little frustrated, that's sort of a helpful process. So, but I'm assuming there's like, there'll be a point at which I could be so self-denigrating that it's just not helpful, because it's just shit. Yeah.
I feel you just give me like the example of hitting a tennis shot into the net, and then my reply is going to sound like really deep in reply to that. But like I'm only kind of, because he's standing out to me just saying it. So he's saying the words of our mind sculpt the past and thus set up a narrative for us to follow in the future. So I guess applying that to what you're saying is that you're providing a commentary on like, I did this thing maybe incorrectly, and here's how I could do it better in the future. Like that sounds, that's like a really healthy example of that, rather than just like swearing at yourself. Like I was playing golf today.
Well, there can be both.
I was going to say, like, I was playing golf today and I was doing like really well. I was feeling like quite competitive, and I was in the zone, and I like shanked a shot, and just my negative self-talk was just horrendous. I was like angry at myself. But then like another one, like I did like a good shot, but not like a great shot. Could have been better. And I was like being quite encouraging to myself. I'm like, okay, no, focus. Like, remember your technique that your friend taught you. Like, so I guess just back to that thing. It's like our mind flicks back and forth on like memories and even current events to like shape a narrative that we carry into the future. Like, that for the rest of that tennis game you're in, if you hang on to that one thing that you did, you're going to be like not in the right headspace. So you need to find a way to kind of correct and soothe in that situation. Yeah,
that self-correction has to be a split second, because then the next serve's coming in, right? And I need to be focused back in the game.
And I hadn't thought about it kind of as being such an instantaneous thing, maybe until your example, and then reflecting on my afternoon of golf.
Well, I suppose it depends on what you're up to, right? But if you're middle of a sports game, you don't have time to introspect for very long. You might do that after the match, but there might be other occasions in life where you have plenty of time.
Well, there's kind of, and this might lead on to something he says later on in the book, is that, I'm thinking there's external circumstances outside of yourself, like the game as a whole, or the fact I was playing with 4 other people, so it's my next turn to go. And in tennis, you've got, as soon as you've hit a bad shot over, you've got to reply to the one coming your way. So like engaging in things that, compared to sort of having a difficult conversation and then sitting in a room by yourself for a week, with no chance to reply, like would be a very different sort of scenario. So
let me just see if I've grasped, because there are a few whys as to why we have this. So we can reflect on the past. So there's time travel as a general concept, mental time travel. Part of that's going back to the past. Now I assume that's like I can replay events that have happened, and then usually for me, I might then fantasize maybe what I could have done differently and how that might have played out. And it's kind of like, I suppose on the good side, it's like a learning process, right? You can evaluate what did happen and fantasize what might have happened if I'd done this or this. And presumably the negative side of that is the ruminating and just getting lost in it. Then you got the future, which is about planning. So I can picture what might happen in the future. Oh, well, if I do this, this could happen. If I do this, this could happen. Mentally rehearsing things that are coming up. And then the thread of that is something like your identity, your life narrative, and like making these things fit your image of who you are. That seems to be what I grasped you saying, the point of this inner chatter, or at least introspection, your inner voice.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary to kind of hear back. Helps me sort of clarify it for me. And I think the bit that I think this leads on to really interestingly is in the chapter after that, where he talks about when talking to ourselves backfires, and he's basically
he's talking about the point of the book, right? That because if chat is the negative bit and that's the title, presumably he's focusing on when it goes badly. When it goes,
So he's saying he talks about the executive function of the human brain. So he's saying that this is the CEO of the human brain, and it allows us to make deliberate and logical choices and manages life and kind of steers us through our desires and steps in to override our instinctual processes and reactions. So he's saying we've got this function in our brain that provides that role. And what he's saying is that. Yeah.
Just hearing that, I'm thinking, you said overrides instinctual. So I have a desire, for example, to stay in bed, but I know I've got an appointment soon, and if I'm going to get up, shower, eat, do my routine in time, like my executive function might come in and sort of kick me out of bed. Is that the sort of thing?
Yes. Yeah. It blocks distractions and like filters information. So it might kind of filter through the voices being like, I should probably lie, and it kind of filters through that. So it's like, no, I know better. So he's saying that's how we function in the world. Like constantly there's this like tension release, and our executive function is the CEO and can decide that. But what he's saying, this is really key to the book, and I guess for you to understand as the listener, is that like we have a limited ability to use this. So like we don't have unlimited resources. This is not a function that is just sort of like has endless amounts of energy. And he's saying that when we're stuck in that inner voice with like anxious thoughts, negative assessments, kind of overly focusing on like, wants and ruminations, this steals energy from the executive function. And basically leads us to not being able to pay attention properly. So like that's a really key part of that.
What comes to my mind hearing that is sometimes I'll be reading and I can just get lost for maybe hours, and it's effortless. And presumably that's when my life's just outside of reading that book is just feeling fine. And then there's sometimes I'm reading where it's like where every other line or paragraph it's like I didn't take any of that in. I was fantasizing about something else. I have to go back, start again, and I can spend hours and I just don't get past that first page, and it's very frustrating and exhausting. And it's like I keep catching my mind's dragged away, and presumably my executive function keeps reeling it back in, but it comes at a cost.
And I think that cost is so key because it obviously affects our ability to do things like deep work, focus for like sustained periods of time, respond from our most authentic selves. Like you can just imagine in general, like if there's a way of summarizing, it's basically like we run out of energy to focus on what matters and we become distracted. And I think that if you kind of play that back to like what chatter sounds like, it's like, oh, that kind of makes sense. Like if we're stuck in our heads about like negative assessments of the world or judgments or things that we kind of get caught in, this sort of rabbit hole, this, I don't know what you want to call it, downward spiral, like whatever, like negative loops that we can get in or a person can get in. It's not surprising that we're not able to sort of focus and we're more stressed and it influences like how we engage with other people and influences how we engage with ourselves and impacts things like the level of compassion we can show ourselves. And I think that's probably a key part that you would kind of know through some of your practice.
Well, just to
yeah.
take it to a milder level, even if so I think what I'm hearing you say is we want to be able to focus and concentrate because that helps us stay present or in flow for the things that we've chosen to do that matter to us.
Yeah.
But chatter and our inner voice can get in the way of it. It can distract us, and that can be frustrating. And yes, obviously that can really happen when we're, say, anxious about something, or we're ruminating on a disagreement or conflict. But even just like, it can even just be annoying, even if we're just daydreaming, right? It doesn't even have to be negative emotion involved. But if I'm just trying to focus on something and I just don't really have that skill of mindful attention, I can just get lost in thinking about pretty mundane things, and that still can be quite distracting.
I think it's I guess discernment's probably quite an important thing in these situations, kind of being able to kind of assess whether this chatter or this inner voice is kind of helpful or unhelpful. Is it wise or unwise? Is it sort of serving you in that particular situation or not? Right. Yeah. Like if I'm reading and I'm like, I think I smell smoke. I'm not gonna be like, no, that's just chatter. Go back to your Yeah. So I think that's kind of like the key intro really that I was hoping to kind of get across.
That's just the intro. I thought we were well into it.
well, that's the kind of what is chatter and why is it bad? Essentially,
What I've heard so far, that it's fundamentally bad in the way it distracts us from where we want our attention, focus, concentration, and where we would like that to be in any given moment. And also you mentioned there about how it might inhibit or self-compassion or sort of have us suffer more. I'm assuming that we might need to.
Yeah. I think, and the next part of the book is really talk about some strategies and kind of like why they're helpful around, how to not allow chatter to consume you. And he refers to this as like to lower its temperature, essentially, like just to kind of bring it down and not take over so much of that executive function and not become such a negative influence in our life. Yeah.
Great. Let's dive in. What are some of the favorite ways we can help ourselves then?
Well, I think the key one he talks about at the end of the book, there's a whole list of like tools. Okay. So I'll go through them at the end, the ones we don't cover, just in case we miss any. But one of the key ones he talks about is zooming out. So you're saying like if we think of our mind as a lens and our inner voice is a button that can like zoom in or zoom out. So chatter is when we zoom in on something that has like inflamed emotions attached to it, to the exclusion of alternative ways of thinking, we lose perspective. So he's saying when we're stuck in chatter, we're too narrowed in on what's going on in that voice. But then obviously zooming out, it sort of allows us to see things a lot more clearly, gain perspective, increases the likelihood of like, positive problem solving, and allows us to take on different views of the situation and acquire different information as to how to solve the problem or use a wiser mind to address what we're facing, essentially. So they're the two contrasting parts of that. Yeah.
So we can be so honed in on a problem or situation that we've lost perspective, and there are ways in which we can zoom out to help us problem solve, see a different perspective. That's what I'm grasping. I'm trying to think of an example we could apply to this. Maybe, I suppose, like, I don't have a specific, but like if you've had an argument, it's very easy to start like be ruminating about everything they said that I thought was unfair or like hurt me or something, and I can be very sucked in on like, I don't know, maybe one sentence of a 15-minute discussion. That might be an area where this would apply, where maybe I would do well to broaden out my focus and think about the wider context of that argument or something.
Yeah. It's almost like talks about seeing it from like a bird's eye view, and then obviously if you're seeing it from higher up, that you have perspective on the issue. And I guess perspective would mean that you are smaller in the grander context of what's going on.
Yeah.
And your individual, I guess, frustrations or ruminations or irritability in that situation is therefore given space, and you can see it clearer. He's saying he says that distance doesn't solve our problems, but it increases the likelihood that we can. So it unclouds the verbal stream we have. And I think particular to chatter, it's if there's a lot of like a story in your mind about something, or you're stuck on a certain part of a conversation, it's kind of like a way to unhook and see it clearer. As opposed to fueling it more, like giving it more fuel by focusing like the more narrow you focus on it, it's like you're giving oxygen to the fire.
I'm thinking about Peep Show and how you can have like the point of view camera where you're like in say Mark's head and you're seeing everything from his perspective, or like you can have a camera angle where you can see both characters at once, and then as the observer you're getting a more sort of balanced view of what's happening. Or you can be in the other point of view camera, and then like you kind of got three perspectives on the whole situation rather than just the one.
Gotcha. I hear what you're saying, but I'm also really happy we just slipped in a Peep Show reference into the podcast. So I'm trying to think what else. He's saying that.
How do we do that? I get the concept, but how does he suggest we kind of help take these different perspectives?
Well, he's saying there's a couple of tools he's got here. So he says one of those is temporal distancing. So this is mental time travel into the future. So it gets you to ask, how will you feel 10 years from now about this problem you're going through? Yeah, I know. I was thinking that. Yeah. So he's saying, our experience is temporary, so we can have hope that things will change.
It's just
the world is. And he says that leads to less blame and more forgiveness. Situations, if you can kind of jump to that point and as if you were looking back on where you are now. And he's also saying writing and narrating experiences from a narrator's perspective gives us distance. So that's an interesting way of writing. I remember going to a writing course once, and they were saying like, try writing from different people's perspectives, like writing as if you were advising a friend on what to do in this situation, or reframe other things. Here is like reframing your challenge, your experience as a challenge. Having that, thinking about growth mindset versus fixed mindset, like when you're going through something. Like these are all different ways of, I suppose, zooming out and seeing the chatter and that negative, whatever it is, image, words, situation in your head differently. So it's like changing the view. So writing more expressively.
Okay, so just go hone in on this. So it might be, well, first and foremost, just writing about the situation I'm hearing could help. But then specifically writing about it, you said from a narrator's point of view. So rather than as myself, I'm describing a situation sort of objectively as I'm witnessing, as I'm me as just a character in this story that I can just write about, and that helps generate this perspective you're talking about. That does sound helpful. Yeah.
And sort of a way of like normalizing your experience as well. So I can kind of get a bit of perspective, and ways of doing that is, have thinking about, have other people been through this before, or would other people be thinking about this in the same way if they were in your shoes? I think there's a lot of other books we've done that tie in to this, think about, the growth mindset, compassion focused therapy book we did, the Tara Brach book on radical acceptance, those sorts of things. Like, just a way to stand back and in the process be kind to yourself as a way of changing the way you talk to yourself. Like, because I guess the ultimate goal is that, yes, you reduce the temperature of this chatter, but also that like you develop a kinder voice overall in general, one that doesn't kind of respond in the way it does and is, more growth orientated and more compassionate.
Yeah. So there's like, well, what I have in mind hearing all this is like cognitive therapy, mindfulness, and like, so with cognitive therapy, the premise is very similar to this book, right? That the way we think and interpret situations determines how we feel about it. But the answer there is like, what if we check our thoughts for how rational or helpful or distorted they might be, and reshape them and reframe situations that can help us see things a little clearer. Whereas a mindful perspective is more about it doesn't really matter what your thoughts are because they're just bloody thoughts. So like, don't take them so seriously. If you're able just to notice them as objects for what they are, it doesn't really matter what they're saying, because you don't have to buy into them as true or commands or like influential if you're able just to see them as, you would hear a radio in the corner of your room or something. So there are like these different strategies, and it sounds like he's taking like a few on board. So he's not necessarily challenging thoughts, but it's more like perspective shifting. So
yes, yeah.
If I can first notice that I'm having inner chatter, that would be a helpful start. I'm sure like the first skill is to notice that it's happening in the moment, right? But then he's saying not so much challenging them, but finding different perspectives on them and different time frames of them. So if I can see it from someone else's perspective and maybe use writing to help get that down, if I can think how much this thing matters in a bigger time scale, a month, week, year, whatever. And then lastly, you were saying about compassion voice. So then there's the tone of how we then choose to speak to ourselves if we do it deliberately rather than on autopilot.
Yes, yeah. I think that's a very important one. Yeah, the tone. Yeah, there's a interesting one kind of threaded into this where he talks about, referring to yourself from different perspectives as well when you do talk to yourself. So often we say I am feeling this, or I am experiencing this, or I want this. And he's saying that kind of is quite a like a protective way of talking about ourselves, as if we're the center of our universe and that we are the one with the problem, and we are like, and it's that kind of I that can fuel that inner voice that kind of keeps you trapped in your, I guess in his word, like in your head. It's like,
in your point of view,
everything's kind of from your point of view directed at you. That's not going to facilitate wise reasoning, and isn't entirely focused on protecting yourself. So he says when he refers to it as distant self-talk. So that's a key idea of this book. He's saying that, it sidesteps like quite a lot of like effort and goes straight to the brain level and like subdues your inner voice with your inner voice. So he's saying, referring to yourself like, so referring to myself as like, Will, like what's best for Will, or what would Will do, or what would this is happening to, so using the first, second and third person to refer to yourself, and it's more encouraging and not catastrophizing. Whereas I guess if it's all I, we're kind of going into the threat system. Whereas if we can distance ourselves through our language, we're able to kind of step out of that threat system.
Yeah. So speaking to ourselves as we would, well, if I'm using third person, it's like I'm talking to you about someone else,
Yeah.
Arthur went to the shops. So I'm not in second person, I'd be talking to you about you, but in third person, I'd be talking to someone else about someone else.
I'm glad you're doing this because I couldn't follow this. Yeah.
Well, first person is I, right? So like, that's what you just described. I'm self-involved. I'm in my own perspective. And if that's involved with this chatter, how we can get lost in the rumination and stuff. If I'm using my own name, I'm then in third person, and we use third person to speak to someone else about a third person. And so I can really see how that can distance it, because it's like I'm talking to me about me, but I'm like 2 steps removed from my I. I'm like, well,
yes,
Luke did this, and then he went here, and then this happened, and then so and so said this to him, and he responded like this. I could imagine how translating your language that way can give you that distance. Yeah.
So yeah, that's one of zooming out. One of the solutions he proposed, zooming out. Yeah.
So it's less. So there was one based on time, right? Thinking about this, whatever situation you're in the grand scheme of your day, week, or life. That's one way of zooming out. And then the other way is like taking the third person perspective on your situation. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a interesting part that I found, I think would be interesting for us to talk about, is it's called the power and peril of other people. So he's saying that when we are, I guess, worried about something or overthinking or engulfed in chatter and negative emotions, quite often people feel compelled to share this with other people.
Yeah.
And he's saying that that doesn't necessarily help us recover from what we're experiencing or worrying about in a meaningful way, and it can exacerbate our feelings of helplessness. And it's he does talk a bit earlier in the book about like how people actually don't like being around that. There's like a social people have a emotional limit to hearing people's negativity.
Yeah. Are we talking about complaining, basically?
Well, he's saying sharing emotions. So
okay.
if you want to call that complaining, no. But he's saying like no, you can get in like a co-rumination trap as well. So, as humans, we're kind of drawn to a tend and befriend response. So the more people I share my problem with, the more I feel I'll belong. So people often go and tell a lot of people about what's going on in their mind, and they're not actually getting their own, not be able to zoom out in the ways we've just spoken about, because they're getting really sucked into trying to satisfy their emotional needs through complaining or from oversharing their emotions. Like they're wanting to receive empathy and not solutions. So what? Okay, well, I won't jump to the next, but
well, the reason I say complaining is because when I initially heard what you said, I was like, well, I don't always find, I don't know, maybe it's, I'm trained as a therapist, but I don't think it's this. But when I don't find necessarily people sharing how they feel with me unpleasant or bad. Like sometimes it can be really bonding, right? And like can mean a lot. But I think can tune into sort of what you mean when people are almost aimlessly talking about negative things, even in a circular way, or where they're not really looking for things to be better, but they're just sort of aimlessly venting. And I suppose that's what I meant by complaining. And I can see how on the receiving end of that, that can be sort of draining and like not alienating, but it like almost too much of it wipes you out of the equation, right? Because you don't have a real input about that.
Yeah. And he's saying that the I guess it's more just kind of like an awareness to think, have you tried distancing yourself, or have you tried other ways of kind of explaining this to yourself, or trying to get a fresh perspective? Because he's saying when we recall the story, we re-enter into the emotions, we suck people into co-rumination. And on an individual level, the more we talk, the more upset we can become. And it's fresh logs on the fire of the inner voice. And he's saying by sharing, it helps us feel connected, but it doesn't creatively reframe how to address what we're going through. So it fuels the threat response, and you're going from one negative thought to the next, instead of finding ways to kind of like wisely address what's going on. And he's saying that my understanding of what he's saying is that a wise response to seek from other people is one which addresses kind of your emotional needs to feel understood, but also provides with some kind of logical, big picture advice that can help you move forward.
Okay, so let me catch up with that. So in terms of the chatter we're talking about now, when we externalize that internal chatter to someone else.
Yeah.
And that can be, it can feel sort of relieving in the sense of, well, someone else is hearing me. It can breed a sense of belonging, but it can have the negative effect of like simply rehashing a negative situation in a way that's not processing it any further. It's just staying in it and dragging the other person into it and having them feel unpleasant as well. And you get something instantaneously, almost like I'm thinking of it's like eating sugar. It's like, yes, I get a payoff instantly, but I'm not getting a further benefit. I've just stayed stuck where I am, something like that.
Yeah. You're saying we need to, so you're saying when talking to other people, and this is, I guess, advice for the friend providing the ways to distance. He's saying that we need to address people's emotional and cognitive needs. So people need to know that they're not in danger first, that they're safe to share. And they're able to immerse in that for a second, but then they're able to distance.
Yeah.
He uses an example that probably flew over my head, but you watch Star Trek? Is that you do, don't you? Yeah. So he says we need to have equal amounts of Kirk and Spock.
Yeah.
So we need to offer the comfort of Kirk and the intellect of Spock.
Yeah.
And I'm watching you smile because that makes sense to you, but it didn't make sense to me. But I thought I'd write it down because I know you listen, you watch it. So
yeah. Well, Kirk is human and emotional and sort of warm in his own way, whereas Mr. Spock is half Vulcan, which means he represses all emotion and is extremely logical. So I suppose he's saying that, we can get our sort of human emotional needs met first. And then you're saying that for that then to have more benefit than just comfort in the moment, we then need the logic and the problem solving and the like, what are we actually going to do about this next?
Yeah.
Great.
So that's that chapter.
And presumably to reverse that, I don't know if he says this, but this has this comes up in loads of self-help books, that usually people jump to the problem solving first, right? When someone comes with a problem, actually they just want empathy, and someone just was like, or do this, or that was a mistake, and like they're jumping in with the cognitive before the emotional
too soon.
Well, that can also be a problem, right? Because you don't connect with the person.
And he's so in the last kind of like part of the book, he basically just lists the tools. So there's tools that involve other people. So he's saying, find ways to address emotional and cognitive needs, as we said. And he said other ways, he says, is providing invisible support. So doing things in the background for people that will make their life easier. Just to sort of
invisible support.
Providing invisible support. So I guess supporting people in ways that sort of make their environment less stressful, as a way of supporting their chatter. And then he says tools for receiving chatter support. So if you're the one who is kind of like reaching out for support with your chatter, and he's saying, build a board of advisors. So he's saying like pick your people in your life who you share with and make sure they're varied so that you're not kind of getting the same sort of advice from different.
Yeah.
You're not getting the same advice, but from different people. Saying like seek out physical contact, look at the photo of a loved one, perform a ritual with others. I'll get into ritual later. He spoke a bit about like the use of social media to gain support, but like how people after I'm probably not going to explain this fully, but there was a school shooting in America, and everyone kind of immediately was like sharing online, and they felt like a lot of support online.
Yeah. But
it wasn't healing in the long term because it was kind of only kind of back to what we're saying, like it was only really addressing they're only kind of able to like emotionally get out what was on minds, but they weren't actually able to process and move on as quickly as they'd like. Is my understanding. I might have brushed over that quite quickly, but
well, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but I can, like, I don't really use social media, but I've heard and can guess how it can just inflame your already hardened position, because you get stuck in echo chambers and people just finding people who just agree with what you already think, which might give you that sense of bonding and social support you talked about, but not so much the seeing other perspectives and actually processing and assimilating a broader understanding of the situation, which you might get if you got other viewpoints after you were calm and your threat system was, you got your bonding. It's like, okay, well, now how do I really make sense of this by understanding it from another point of view? Or I don't know, in this case it might be quite extreme, but like understanding, well, what is going on with someone that they end up shooting at school? Like, yes, I might need to vent all my anger initially, but in the long run, I might do well to really understand the psychology of how this happens in our culture, and that might help me, heal in the long run as well.
There's a couple more parts I was really keen to explain to you. I guess I'm not giving you many chances to ask questions because I'm just cracking on. But there's one part he talks about outside in. So talk about how our environment can help us with chatter and manage internal stresses, and how our environment influences psychological processes. So he spoke about the idea that William James introduced around there's two types of attention. So there's involuntary attention. So objective attention has an inherently intriguing quality to it. So that's when we look at something involuntarily, but then a voluntary attention is about our will shining a spotlight on what we want. And this is a limited resource. And he's saying that going out in nature is full of those things that draw our involuntary attention. So it's kind of stimulating, and we're kind of like glancing at like that pretty tree or that river that's going past, and it's stimulating, but it's not exhausting, and allows us to recharge. And that's like a very specific part of the chapter I've focused in on, but it gets me thinking about what it is if I'm feeling, stressed or overthinking something, or worried or whatever, like what is it that takes me out of that headspace? And
we've got that
more, but like one thing is this, like getting into nature and seeing being surrounded by like subtle beauties, as opposed to necessarily like stark distractions, So there's what you just defined there as like voluntary attention sounds basically the same as what you defined earlier as executive functioning, right? It's that purposeful concentration on something. Whereas the flip side is involuntary attention, where something grabs our attention, which makes sense, right? It's why you might prefer to read like in a library where people remain quiet, rather than somewhere where, people can tap you on the shoulder, or there's a loud conversation happening next to you, or these things that grab your attention that you don't want to grab your attention. And which might trigger this inner chatter that ends up not being helpful. And I like the thought of something being, rather than kind of like sitting in a room with like complete space and complete quiet, where, you could give yourself space to sort of like deepen into what you're experiencing, or like worry more or something. You're practically doing something that's kind of taking your mind off it, but it's not like distracting yourself entirely, which I think isn't as helpful, because I guess he says early in the book that it kind of comes back to bite you a bit harder if like we used to think that just distracting ourselves from negative chatter was the way through it, but actually it's the outside in approach.
It just reinforces avoidance.
Have you got any what things have you got in your life that really kind of shrink the self? What's when you're
shrink
caught
the
up
self
in something? So like stops you from over immersing in something you're working through, or I don't know, if you're having a bad day or a bad week or whatever, like what is it? Is it hiking or like
what helps?
Gig?
Like,
yeah, what helps? I'm just curious, like what examples have you got? Like,
yeah, well, what he just said there,
yeah.
like there's a nature reserve half a mile up the road, and like I'll frequently go there and just walk around it, and like that'll real calm my nervous system down. Oh yeah, I was interested in what you were saying there, because it was like, on the one hand, if you just put me in a silent white room, that could be quite stressful, right? And I could imagine my inner chatter going on hyperdrive. But on the other hand, like walking through the crowded city centre would also be stressful. And so in terms of that voluntary, involuntary attention thing, I can see how, I'm not sure why, but it's probably some evolutionary thing, but how nature is sort of a nice middle ground where it's like, yes, I'm being stimulated, but it's still calming and soothing. I'm not being like hustled by people or like random like emergency vehicles aren't like passing me by, or like buses aren't smogging around. Like it's like stimulating, but in a pleasant way. And I could see how there could be a sort of optimum there for calming the nervous system, and then therefore that's a nice like platform to help you, I don't know, introduce more of these tools about how you might distance yourself from your chatter or something, which I can definitely relate to, like going hiking, going walking in the woods. It's like, yeah, I love it.
Yeah, mine would be going to like gigs, like music gigs, just like being in that room, like listening to the band play. And I guess like music can hit you in different frequencies, right, than everyday life. You know, like things that you don't get to do on a regular basis that just like take you out of your immediate environment. And
okay, I suppose that's one where it could really like, but it's not where you would go to process, is it? But like you're saying, the experience would overall help you kind of. Yeah.
We kind of leave those experiences with a new sense of perspective, maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
Like as in going out in nature, or like, you know, seeing something, seeing a massive mountain, or standing in the rain or something, you know, like it's something that just, makes it feel less about you.
Okay. I think I misunderstood. I thought you meant like,
I think it's two sides to it.
Optimize my environment to do processing, like to engage in this distancing or this compassionate inner chat, or to think about another perspective, or to problem solve. But then there's also like, what can you just do to take a step back generally and have an experience which, just doesn't make your inner chat seem as a big of a problem maybe after the fact.
Or
like
when you
like
leave
a gig where it's like a big human group bonding experience where you're naturally focused and in flow, perhaps if you enjoy the music, which I can imagine like and then like leaving that with a new sense of there is a difference between the two, but like leaving that with a sense of perspective. Sometimes it is kind of like removing yourself from the environment and then re-entering back into it with fresh way of looking at things. Like sometimes like you go on holiday, and just by leaving the house and the town you've been in day to day, week on week for months, it's just like, wow, like, people are just living differently here for a bit. And it's like, it suddenly gives you that literal distance from anything that you're associating with your day to day home life.
You might realize that your job isn't what you want to return back to, or something like that.
Right. So, or even like just traveling more broadly, where you do see different cultures. That's like, just opens your eyes to seeing life in a whole different way that you don't usually consider.
So a few other, I guess, sort of wrapping up on some of the strategies he talks about. So he's saying that creating order in our physical environment provides the order we seek internally. So I absolutely loved this one. So he's basically saying, like, as a way of compensating kind of negative thoughts or ruminations or worries, that we can, tidy up our space and create order and create structures. And this goes further to say, like, having rituals, things that have sequence, that are infused with meaning, connects us to forces larger than ourselves, connects us to values, redirects our attention, broadens our perspective, prevents being preoccupied with other plans. To list a few, I like the thought of something I do if I'm just a bit caught up, or if ever I've just sort of been, I guess, like worried about something, or just having a difficult week. Like, that's when I put more structure in, because it's sort of that order keeps things contained. It's something that's reliable, predictable.
So routines, habits.
Yeah, routines, habits. Yeah, all these things, like, to be good for you. It kind of, he says, it gives us a stronger perception of control. And this is like the belief we possess the ability to impact the world in ways that we desire. So,
it's that self-efficacy. Like, if I can have ways in which what I do affects the world in a way I can predict and control.
Yeah,
it's like
we have influence. Yeah, and it's saying when we don't have that sense of perceived control, that's when chatter can really get fired up.
Yeah,
because we're feeling out of control, and that what ifs and what can I do about, I can't do anything about this, like those sorts of ways of thinking, like kind of proving to yourself
is at the core of depression. So if for too long things just happen to us that feel completely out of our influence, like learned helplessness and depression is sort of the natural consequence of that sequence. So I can see why instilling just the constant things in your life that are in your control, that you feel efficacious about doing, can just sort of keep that at bay.
Yeah, so some of the key ones. He talks about just one part of the book. He talks about the placebo effect.
Okay,
how kind of expecting to feel a certain way can produce a positive outcome. So he's saying, like, how expectations govern how we function, allows us to guess what's going on, and silences our doubts. So he's saying, and this is a bit that I maybe found slightly tricky to get my head around, but like, he's basically saying, like, try and introduce some placebo effects into your life, but like how we do that ourselves is
it's hard to do that when you're doing it for a placebo. Like, I'm going to take the sugar pill and feel better. Yeah.
He's saying, there's so many areas in life that we've based automatic beliefs on, that, like, if a doctor tells us to do something, then we trust it and it'll make us feel better. So I guess he's saying, like, trust in solutions and trust in rituals and
So you've already said, I found this a bit hard to get my head around, and I am too. So I don't want to put you on the spot by asking, but how does he suggest we use the placebo effect on ourselves?
He's saying, my understanding was that we have automatic beliefs we have about things based on very little information. Sometimes that, for example, around the doctor, like, we don't have much information about, we can't just inherently trust that the doctor will give us the right
that they
information,
prescribe us something, we believe it will help. And it could, obviously, this goes well back, doesn't it, the placebo effect, but they could be sugar pills, but we could still get a lot better because of how much faith we have in the idea that it's going to help us.
So having faith in those sorts of ideas, essentially.
I suppose I would struggle to know how to do that to myself without knowing that I'm tricking myself. I can see how it would work with, like, people I already have faith in, like doctors or something. But I'm not quite sure how I could apply that to myself.
But that's the book. That's what I've got.
Cool.
You got any more questions or any reflections, or how was that for you?
All right, let me soak it in. I'll soak it in by summarizing what I've understood. So he's a cognitive psychologist. So he's looking at cognition and how an aspect of that cognition is in a talk, essentially. perhaps that broadens to like images as well, but largely we're talking about how we talk to ourselves in our mind, which can be really helpful because it helps us plan for the future, learn from the past. But the aspect of that which he's calling chatter is how it can be unhelpful. It can be unhelpful because it can distract us from focused attention. It can like elongate and prolong distress further than it might need to be by just replaying negative situations in our mind. And so the rest of the book is like, well, how do we sort of preserve the helpful inner dialogue, and how can we manage the bits that's negative? So that's the premise. And then we can do that by different ways of distancing. So kind of, and here's where it sounds a lot just like Stoicism and CBT. So it's like taking different perspectives over time, using writing, looking at your situation as if you were a third person, someone else, for example, so you can broaden your perspective. That can be hard to do on your own. So when you do it with someone else, they can help you by, yes, empathizing with you, but not just letting you ruminate. But once you've kind of got that bond, you felt understood, then introduce these things, that the new different perspectives, the problem solving after you've felt maybe understood. And I think you mentioned touch, like, yeah, calm down, like your threat system is like soothed. Yeah, that's what I've got. I think what I've heard so far that's newest to me and that I'm probably going to take from this is using the third person, particularly if I was writing, so I'm journaling about something that's difficult. Out of everything I've heard so far that feels kind of like new and something I might try is like, well, I might try writing this, but not saying I, but actually narrating it like I'm talking about someone else and seeing how that goes. So that's what I've taken. Yeah, that sort of excites me.
I think I'll try that too. Yeah.
What in that kind of summary do you think might be key that I've missed, or something that personally for you is like, oh, I really like this bit too, and that was sort of missed?
I think a key part of it for me is, I guess, just the reflection that like how much energy this takes from your level of focus. And he does go into talking about, the impacts of stress, which made me think of the Robert Sapolsky book we did on why zebras don't get ulcers. But like made me think about like that this is something to, whether I'm working with people at work or whether for myself, if I get caught in these traps, is that is actually something you need to do something about. Like you can't, well, you can, but it's not helpful. It's not helpful to fuel this. And I guess once you have that perspective that you're like, this is actually bad for me, like in terms of like my energy level and focus, that sort of thing. It creates a new level of, maybe urgency is the wrong word, but a new level of importance to actually like try these strategies and address them by myself before trying to get an external opinion on it. And tied into that is more like compassionate processes involved in that as well. Yeah.
I suppose it's in terms of maybe a cultural assumption that it's challenging. Maybe it's this idea that introspection is sort of inherently a positive thing. And he's kind of saying, well, it depends on how you do it. Like it can certainly be negative. Just ruminating. And so, I can see that it's a challenge to maybe someone who thinks, well, if I just journal or speak to a friend about this, that's me seeking support and that's helpful. And he's saying, it kind of needs to be a bit more nuanced than that, because if you're just going over the situation and how you feel, you could potentially just be sinking yourself further into it and ruminating in a way that's not helpful for you.
And going within isn't So like, yeah, there's more to it than just that. It's not just like going in and just sort of like just jumping in with the the worries. It's more about like, well, how can I distance from them and proactively do something on a cognitive level and an emotional level as well. I guess the more emotional level is where the compassion comes in, and the more cognitive level is where some of these strategies around like distancing and referring to yourself in the third person, those strategies come in. So a balance between the two that you need both.
Yes. Yeah. Great.
There we go. All right. Happy with that. Thanks for...
I feel like I've... Well, I wonder if you agree, but I feel like I've pretty much grasped the key concepts and got a few takeaways I could employ if I wanted to try this out.
Nice one, mate. Great to see you again, and great to chat about some new and important ideas.
Yeah, thanks for all your efforts. That's helpful.
Cheers, mate. See you later.
Bye.
Mate, bye.